Hello there and welcome to another video. This is another list video, being the best and the worst from a little gem from Canada called Kenny versus Spenny. Now you may be wondering what Kenny versus Spenny is. Well, it's basically a show where two men go against each other in a competition. Basically, they have to do a certain task for a remainder of maybe a week or even a few days, and whoever loses has to do a humiliation at the end. Now usually Kenny wins via cheating, but Spenny does try to play by the rules, and he has won a few competitions. For this video, we're going to go through 10 of what I consider the best Kenny versus Spenny episodes, from my least favourite, but obviously favourite, to my most favourite, and also the 10 worst, which is the slightly less bad to the absolutely appalling. Now, I'll be going through why I don't like them or why I do like them, and I'll be trying to interchange it so you won't be watching all the worst list and then all the good list. And yeah, hope you enjoy this video. But before we begin, we're going to go through some honourable mentions. These are the episodes that didn't really make it onto the best list, but are deserving of some praise here and there. So my honourable mentions, as I've just mentioned, are basically the ones that didn't make it onto my best list, but still deserve some praise. So the first up is Who is the Better Parent? It's a very funny episode, especially for a Series 1 episode, which is probably infamous for being a pretty lackluster series, with very lackluster challenges and lackluster, comedy. But Who is the Better Parent is absolutely hilarious. Basically, they are given these realistic dolls, and they have to look after it for a few days. Now, Kenny just abuses his doll and is trying to kill his baby, while Spenny is looking after the baby and doing everything right. Kenny obviously hatches a plan to try and swap the babies around, or to swap the batteries around, which successfully happens by the end of the episode. Kenny wins, and of course Spenny is humiliated. Blindfold is another great episode. Basically, both of them are forced to wear a blindfold for a few days and basically are unable to see anything. However, Kenny doesn't actually put on his blindfold and instead gets someone else to come in to cause havoc, when reality is that other person actually isn't in the household, and just torture Spenny for the whole few days. It's a very funny episode once again, and another good Series 1 episode, which is surprising. Piss Off the Most People is a very fantastic episode. Basically, Kenny and Spenny have to do a bunch of things out in public to annoy a load of people. Kenny ends up winning because he ends up paying for a plane which has something saying like Jesus sucks on it, and obviously that ends up pissing off a lot of people, and of course Kenny wins just outright because of that. Very funny episode, didn't make it onto this though. Best Soldier is a really, really good episode. Essentially, Kenny and Spenny are given a drill sergeant who is basically going to command them throughout the whole week. Now, Spenny is trying to suck up to the drill sergeant from the very beginning, but he doesn't really have any experience when it comes to military stuff, whereas Kenny, who actually went over to the Gulf War to report on it, knows some things about the military here and there. He also manages to just make a mess of himself on the first day, but as the week progresses, he ends up becoming a more valuable soldier, whereas Spenny loses his temper with Kenny because he knows what Kenny is like, and ends up losing because Kenny actually ends up being a proper soldier in a way. Homelessness is a very good episode. It's once again, both of them are out on the streets and they're forced to be homeless for the whole week. Basically, they have to not go inside or stay inside for a whole week or for a few days, and Kenny obviously cheats once again. He ends up going to the bank and getting money, ends up getting nice food, and even sleeping inside a store at one point. Whereas Spenny plays by the rules, and Spenny ends up having a miserable experience, and he ends up realising just how bad it is for the homeless to live their lives. Ultimately, Spenny loses because he gets arrested, which means he ends up staying indoors. It's a very good episode, but once again, didn't make it onto the best list. The weed episode is probably going to be quite surprising to some people, but the weed episode is very good. Don't get me wrong, it's quite wholesome in a weird way, because they're both actually friendly towards each other. Well, high off their heads, they're high as a kite. But unfortunately, or at least for me, the weed episode isn't really a proper competition, because they end up, screwing themselves over because they forget how much weed they've actually smoked. And I won't lie, the episode does feel quite slow at times. Whilst it is a very popular episode, I just find it very slow at some moments. And yeah, I'm not really a fan of this episode, but I don't really hate it at the exact same time. The obese episode is another really good episode. Basically, they have to wear these weights to mimic a obese person. However, Kenny takes off his takes off his weights at the very beginning and ends up putting on makeup, and he pretends to be this flat slouch. Well, Spenny, he's suffering with his weights because he's basically had makeshift weights instead of like proper weights. And while Kenny goes off to take the piss out of obese people, Spenny is forced to lie on the ground, do nothing all the time because he is struggling with the weights that he stupidly decided to put on. Near towards the end of the episode is one of the most fantastic pranks that Kenny has ever done to Spenny, where he essentially gets someone else to pretend to be him inside his room, not wearing the weights, playing video games, while he goes in and he purposely shows off his finger because Kenny has a shorter finger, and Spenny thinks that that's not the real Kenny. He then goes off to find Kenny in his room, and he thinks that he is one, so he takes off all his weights when the reality is Kenny is actually the guy downstairs, and he was just wearing a fake finger, and the person in his room was just another actor wearing a mold of his face. Very great stuff. Who Can 69 the Longest is a very funny episode. I just love the way the producers turn against Kenny and Spenny in this. They just abuse them. The only issue with this episode is that, well, not a lot actually happens. You'd think in an episode where they're both forced to be tied or stuck to each other on a 69 position, it would be very good. But the issue is, and this is for me personally, the issue is there's not a lot that happens with it. Most part is they struggle to move around, and they slap each other. Kenny farts in Spenny's face, but then they lie on a sofa for like a good chunk of the episode, and even the producers get bored, which is why they start torturing both of them, which is probably where the highlight of the episode comes in. Who Does She Like More is a controversial choice for honourable mention, but because I have seen a lot of people not really like this episode, but I actually think this is quite a funny episode. Essentially, both Kenny and Spenny go on a date with a girl. However, Kenny goes first, and by going first, he's able to then trick Spenny into going out with another girl, which I believe is his cousin or something like that. And this other girl is already going to choose Kenny no matter what. And he gets a person, a really unhygienic, ugly, horrible human being, to play Spenny with the actual girl. So, of course, while the actual girl suffers with this horrible human being, Spenny is essentially making a fool of himself in front of the fake girl. And what's ironic about the Who Does She Like More episode is that Spenny would have lost anyway, because he goes on a tangent at one point, just ranting about Kenny and how evil Kenny is. And, had he just shut up, had he not done that, he probably would have won. But ultimately, well, he wouldn't have won anyway because Kenny cheated. But it's just a funny setup, and I just do I really like this prank. It's really funny overall. Who is the better pro wrestler? Now, this came close to be number 10 on my list, but who is the best pro wrestler? Basically, they have to be pro wrestlers for a day, and Spenny is enjoying this because this is something that he's always wanted to do. He even meets one of his heroes. I don't remember his name. I'm not really good with wrestling, and even gets trained up, while Kenny just doesn't really give a shit. He just doesn't care, and he eventually becomes this horrible spider-faced, topless madman with a hammer. I think it's called Yarf Yarf. I don't remember that goddamn name. But Yarp. That's right, Yarp. And he basically, humiliates Spenny on the day of the pro wrestling competition, because Spenny, instead of staying in character while he's getting beaten up, breaks character multiple times and ends up losing. And you'll see in my lists in a few seconds that Spenny loses a lot of these competitions because he breaks character. But yeah, Who is a Better Pro Wrestler is a lot of fun. It's certainly one of the more bloody episodes. Like, Spenny is just bleeding completely, and at the end you just see this drenched in blood, like, humiliated man. The other honourable mention is arm wrestling. The arm wrestling episode is once again pretty funny. Basically, Kenny and Spenny are meant to have an arm wrestling competition, but Spenny is so paranoid of Kenny that he tells him that he's going to stay away from him, and that this competition is going to be fair. He's going to have to go have an arm wrestle with Spencer Rice. And so Kenny goes to find Spencer Rice, and he finds Spencer Rice, which is this young boy called Spencer Rice. And in front of loads of people, he has an arm wrestling competition with Spencer Rice, and he ends up beating him, and he humiliates Spencer Rice. Well, the real Spenny is just left alone without anyone coming towards him. Eventually, they do have an actual arm wrestling competition because they have an argument with each other, and once again, Spenny loses against Kenny, and it's just a lot of fun. It's just a really funny episode overall. Who can get a boner first is once again a really funny episode. It's a very promiscuous episode, I guess you could say. Genuinely a really funny episode where they both have to try to not get a boner, and the ending to this is absolutely hilarious. So essentially they go to a strip club, and for those that don't know, Kenny has already cheated. He's basically had this boner blocker given to him, so he won't get an erection no matter what. Whereas Spenny hasn't cheated, and Spenny is given a male stripper, while Kenny is given a female stripper, and of course Spenny gets a boner, and it's just such a hilarious ending. My final honourable mention, which I've gone on for quite a long time, is not an episode but rather a deleted scene, and this is the suitcase rant. The suitcase rant is just absolutely hilarious. Basically, in the Who Can Be the Better Basketball Coach episode, Spenny has the piss taken out of him by Kenny, but because he brings a suitcase with him full of makeup and a tie and all sorts of rather weird shit, all things considered. And Spenny, instead of just just letting it pass by, he instead charges upstairs to his room and yells at the camera why he is not an insane, deranged psychopath for having all this stuff. And he says that I must be clearly mentally ill, as he goes on this almost mentally ill rant. And when Kenny comes upstairs, he just yells at Kenny he's just over the top reaction towards just being joked about having a suitcase. And the joke goes on for around 10 minutes, and you can obviously see why this got cut out of the episode, because it was way too long. It would have taken up half the episode, but it is one of the funniest deleted scenes ever, and I totally recommend you see it. Now that I'm done with the honourable mentions, I think we should finally start, and we're going to start off with the 10th worst Kenny vs. Spenny episode. For my number 10 worst is a first season episode called Who is the Better Chef? Now, the first season has a lot of really boring episodes, all things considered, but Who is the Better Chef, for me, feels like a season 1 episode. And what I mean by that is, it feels like an episode that belongs to a first season of a TV show, in the sense that it's very awkward. It's incredibly awkward to watch, because there's not a lot of gags in this episode, and it's a very straightforward competition. Basically, both have to cook a 3-course meal. And from the very beginning, we already know that Spenny is screwed, because Spenny cannot cook to save his life. Anything he cooks burns, and we've seen this in a previous episode by this point. While Kenny knows how to cook, and his mother has taught him quite well how to cook. So Kenny's already got an advantage. So Spenny decides he's going to try and cheat this time, and this is something I'm going to be saying a lot about these worst episodes, is that a lot of these worst episodes feel like they're staged. And I know that Kenny and Spenny have gone on many different podcasts and said on several of the behind-the-scenes stuff that none of the show is staged, but honestly, it's a reality show. There's going to be some staging here and there. And this is an example where I feel like the staging does sort of happen, in the sense that it feels like a formulaic episode. Oh wow, let's just have an episode where instead of Kenny cheating, let's have Spenny cheating. That's a real shocker. And whilst it isn't as obvious as some of the later editions I've got on my worst list, it is kind of there. And honestly, this episode is just really boring. I don't know what else to say. It's a very boring episode. You'd think a cooking competition between these two would be quite fun, and maybe in a later season it would have been fun. But for this, it isn't fun. And Spenny's way of cheating is basically get a proper master chef, and to hide a walkie-talkie in his hide an earpiece, so that he can communicate with him while he's cooking and teach him how to do things. And he ends up losing anyway. Kenny ends up winning. I mean, Kenny already knows how to cook where Spenny doesn't. And the problem is, this episode it's not very entertaining. There's not a lot of moments that are really entertaining between these in this episode. It's kind of a slow episode. It feels awkward. Like I said, it feels like a series 1 episode. It feels like it's a new show. They're trying to get their foot into gear. They don't actually know what to do. They don't know what's going to work. And it feels like that. It feels painfully slow. It feels painfully like it's struggling to find its identity. And that's the big problem which I have with Who is the Better Chef. It's a boring episode. And honestly, it's one of the most forgettable episodes because I really can't remember many of the moments, like other than Spenny tries to cheat in this but loses, that happens in this episode. It's not particularly memorable. It's kind of dull, and totally recommend you miss this episode. For our number 10 best, Who Can Stay Naked the Longest is a very funny episode. And it's pretty self-explanatory. Basically, Kenny and Spenny have to be naked for the whole competition for the next few days. And Spenny doesn't like being naked, to say the very least. He acts very paranoid. He keeps hiding himself. And one of the main reasons why, and he even admits this, is because of his penis. He thinks that his penis is big enough and normal, but obviously it's heavily implied that his penis isn't very big. And Kenny is more like laid back about it and doesn't actually care about it, but he does obviously hide himself here and there. And so Who Can Stay Naked the Longest includes a lot of laughs, and it's a very fun competition overall. It's a very good idea. My only issues with this episode is that Spenny sort of locks himself inside the house the whole time. He doesn't really do anything. And I think that, while Kenny does actually do some stuff while naked, I think that what could have made for a better episode is the fact that Kenny and Spenny were maybe forced to do things outside. Like maybe the production could have like prodded them with a stick and pushed them outside to do like, I don't know, shopping together while naked, or to do like an ice rink or something like that. I don't know. And I don't know, I felt like they could have done a lot more with this naked episode, but still, it's a very fun episode. And one of the things that I absolutely love about this episode is the running gag involving watches and clocks. Now, throughout this episode, there's a running gag involving Spenny's watch, because Spenny believes that he is still naked, despite the fact that he's wearing a watch. And technically speaking, he's still wearing a piece of clothing, even though it's an accessory. And Spenny, being the very autistic man himself, doesn't really, he doesn't really understand that, Kenny isn't really going to take the competition seriously unless he takes off his watch. And he eventually takes off his watch because, and which kind of annoys him because he needs to see a watch. He needs to tell the time, which for some reason he doesn't observe a war to look at a clock or anything like that. But anyway, I digress. But like Spenny, he eventually takes off his watch while Kenny, wears his large watch. And at some point, Kenny brings in a bunch of homosexual men who rush in and just assault Spenny, to say the very least. Like, he is whipped, he is chased around the house, and it is absolutely hilarious to see. And Spenny becomes so paranoid that he hides himself in the basement and decides to wait the allotted time while holding a kitchen knife. And what Kenny does is one of the greatest tricks he's done in the entire show, and that is he basically forwards every single clock and watch by 10 minutes. So by the time that Spenny comes upstairs thinking that it's time, that the competition is going to end, so that they both have a draw, that no one wins, the reality is he's actually lost because he ends up putting his clothes on thinking the competition's over, when the reality is the time is actually 10 minutes ahead, or 10 minutes behind, I should say. And it's such a brilliant prank, and it's such a great idea, and the idea itself is a very fun idea. I will say this as well, which is why this is at number 10. The humiliation is kind of lame. Essentially, Spenny goes out in public and says, "I've got a small penis." And he yells it out loud, and it's a pretty lame humiliation, all things considered. And the episode, like I said, could have done a lot more with the whole two men being naked and being sort of paranoid of their own bodies idea. Nonetheless, it's a great episode, and I totally recommend you watch it. It's absolutely hilarious overall. At number 9 worst is an idea which actually isn't so bad, and the beginning part of the episode actually isn't so awful, and that is who has the bigger balls. Basically, Kenny and Spenny do a series of competitions to prove that they are more manly than the other. Essentially, Kenny wipes the floor with Spenny, because Spenny, he's way too chicken to do a lot of the things, such as taking a tattoo, whereas Kenny literally just has a dot on him and wins that competition. And he doesn't do the piercing, he doesn't do like the BDSM, etc., etc. However, this episode takes a turn for the worse, and it's why I put this on my number 9, and it's why I absolutely hate this episode, is the ending to this episode. Essentially, Kenny goes into Spenny's room and just wreaks havoc, because he wants to make Spenny completely paranoid, and to show that he has no balls whatsoever. And truth be told, Kenny's been wiping the floor with Spenny at this point, so it's no real reason why he had to do it. But he does it anyway. And what happens is, Kenny and Spenny, or Spenny in particular, freaks out, and his room is destroyed, and he then drives to a location where there's a cliff edge, and he's threatening to jump. And why I really don't like this episode is what I said in my previous worst bit, and what I'm going to say again throughout this worst section, is that when Kenny versus Spenny gets bad, it often feels bad because it feels staged. And this is one of those really staged moments. Like, there is no way that Spenny would have jumped off and done something, especially with camera on him. And it's not even, like, entertaining. It's like, basically, Spenny forces Kenny to forfeit the competition because he has no balls. Literally, that is it. Spenny basically cheats his way to victory, and this isn't like a Kenny cheat, where Kenny cheats and the cheat is absolutely hilarious and overblown and all sorts of like stupidity and insanity and all that. It's instead a really lame way of like winning the competition. I will say this about this episode: the humiliation is brutal. Essentially, Kenny has to lick bird shit off a car. That is horrific. Like, that is absolutely horrific. That is probably the worst like humiliation he's ever done. And I think Kenny, like, years later, did say that was the worst humiliation he ever did. But it doesn't save this episode. This episode has a good concept and actually starts off pretty well, but the ending completely ruins it for me. And it is one of those episodes that I refuse to rewatch because it's just so bad. Like, honestly, I really don't like this episode because of its ending. And this is a case of where the episode didn't have to be bad, but because of the way it ends, because of the way, because of the results of it, it ends up ruining everything, and it ends up creating this tainted image across the board. So yeah, I'm not really a fan of this episode, and I have seen online that this episode tends to appear on worst lists because of this very reason. And yeah, it's a pretty bad episode because of its ending. On a more positive note, my number 9 best is who could be tied to a goat the longest. Essentially, Kenny and Spenny are tied to a goat round the leg, and they have to stay tied to a goat. That's literally the idea of the competition. And Kenny versus Spenny has done a lot of animal-based competitions in the past, but this one definitely takes the biscuit for being the best one and perhaps the most funniest. Everything about this episode is absolutely hilarious from beginning to end. They both fall in love with their goats, in a sense, and it's got this just a lot of humor involved. For example, right at the beginning of the competition, Kenny buys a female goat, which is a much more lighter weight goat, which means that you can travel a little bit better and pick it up better. Whereas Spenny has a male goat, and the testicles of this male goat is gigantic. But also, Spenny has his rope really short, while Kenny actually does an intelligent thing and has a long rope. And what results is a absolutely hilarious like bunch of skits involving the goats. Kenny basically pranks Spenny quite a few times. For example, he makes Spenny thinks that the one of the goats had been poisoned, which hasn't happened. He didn't poison the goat. He also He also gives the goat caffeine, which makes it go all hyper and just drag Spenny across the ground. He also pisses on Spenny's bed, as well as get the goat to shit on Spenny's bed, which is just absolutely mean-spirited but hilarious at the same time. And the pranks keep getting like more severe each time, because by the end of the episode, Kenny, who thinks that Spenny is just going to give up throughout the whole episode, but actually Spenny lasts quite a while to his credit, Kenny decides to do something which is going to shock Spenny into submitting to failure. And it's such a fantastic prank, this. Essentially, Kenny goes to a butcher's shop and returns with a skinned, butchered goat. And he claims that he took his goat to a butcher's shop and he's still tied to the goat. He's still tied to the dead goat. And Spenny looks at this and he is just flabbergasted. He is shocked. He is appalled. He is disgusted. And for very good reason. I mean, if he actually did do that, it would be horrific. And out of like anger and just, pity for the goat, he takes off his rope and just decides to leave the room. However, before he leaves, Kenny announced that he's the winner and reveals that, because for some reason Spenny didn't notice this, that on both legs he had ropes tied to two different goats. One that was a dead goat, and the other, which was his actual goat, hidden behind a door. And it is such a brilliant prank, and I absolutely love this episode. It's a very wholesome episode in a weird way because of how they interact with the goats, and the gags work a lot. It's hilarious from beginning to end. I will say this, though, the humiliation is a little bit lame. I thought the humiliation could have been a little bit better. Basically, Kenny tries to get Spenny's goat to rape Spenny at the end, but the problem is the goat isn't very into it, and for very good reason. And it isn't. It could have been funny, but it kind of wasn't. And he's kind of forces the goat to hump Spenny. Not really the best humiliation in the world, but it's a very good episode and absolutely recommend it. It's probably the best of the animal episodes, but all the animal episodes are good in their own way, such as the rat race or the chicken coop episode, which is absolutely hilarious. But this one takes a biscuit for being the best and perhaps the funniest of the episodes involving animals. Who Makes the Better Porno on paper sounds like a really raunchy and very sexy episode, and truth is, it's actually one of the most boring episodes of this show's history. It's often noted to be one of the worst episodes in the show's history, because when I was doing research, I noticed this episode popped up quite a lot on several people's lists and several people's personal opinions on this show, and when it comes to worst off. But essentially, Who Can Make a Better Porno is about Kenny and Spenny making a porno. Well, not together, but their own separate pornos, where they're going to be judged by basically a porn critic over what makes a good porno. Essentially, Spenny is going to go ahead and make a porno which is nothing more than a stereotypical teacher and student. They basically meet each other and then they fuck sort of porno. Whereas Kenny struggles to come up with an idea, and he then uses puppets and does all sorts of like silly gaggy pornos which are in no way taking it seriously. In the end, Spenny loses because he does a very generic run-of-the-mill porno, whereas Kenny doesn't. He does something unique, which ends up resulting in him winning. And honestly, this episode is just really boring. Like, sure, there's raunchiness, sure, there's sexiness. I mean, you do see people being fucked in this. I mean, if you want to see porn on the telly without actually going ahead and watching porn, then go ahead, you can see this episode. But it's a very boring episode, and the reason why is because 90% of the episode focuses on Spenny. And Spenny isn't as entertaining as Kenny, if we're perfectly being honest. Spenny is kind of boring. And the worst part is, Spenny goes on this really creepy sort of discussion about his fetish, which is teachers. And he reveals that he had an attraction to a teacher. And he goes into sort of creepy detail to the point that this porno that he's making is essentially his power fantasy. And yeah, it's just a really like creepy. He just acts really creepy in general, but like this is one of his creepier moments, and we're going to see his creepiest later on. But nonetheless, Spenny just isn't very entertaining. I think the reason why is because Spenny is more, how do I put it? He takes this competition as actually seriously, whereas Kenny doesn't. And because Kenny doesn't take it seriously, well, what do you expect? What do you expect? You get like silliness, and he obviously doesn't take this competition seriously, and ironically he wins. But also there's no reason why this episode does sort of suck, and that is this episode was heavily edited. For those that are curious, the original episode actually had Kenny submitting a proper porno, and this porno was essentially revenge porn involving Spenny. You see, he had secretly filmed Spenny having sex with someone and was going to submit that as his porno. However, Spenny found out during the episode, or during the filming, and behind the scenes there was a massive row, which resulted in Spenny threatening to quit and Kenny having to basically forfeit this idea and having to do his own idea, which is why he does a bunch of puppet stuff and does a bunch of like random shit. So yeah, essentially we're watching an episode that is basically cropped out or has been heavily edited in such a way that we only see one half of the story. And unfortunately, it's Spenny's half of the story. The episode could have been a lot more raunchy. It could have been a lot more funnier. But instead, it comes across as incredibly boring. And there's not really a lot of laughs to be said in this episode. And honestly, I don't really like it. And there's a reason why this is considered by many to be one of the worst episodes in Kenny vs. Spenny, and why it often appears on a lot of worst lists. I don't know whether this would be count as another animal-related idea or animal-related competition, because who can wear a gorilla suit the longest happens to be one of the most insane but absolutely hilarious Kenny vs. Spenny episodes of all time. Essentially, as the title of the episode is called, both Kenny and Spenny wear a gorilla costume for God knows how long. However, they're wearing it during the heat of summer, so of course they're boiling alive inside the suits. And Kenny decides to act like a proper gorilla and just go out insane, smacking things, breaking tables, throwing shit all over the place, while Spenny tries to educate people about gorillas and all that, which for some reason by this point Spenny was trying to use education in the show, which, let's be honest, no one really gave a shit about. So Kenny and Spenny dress up as gorillas, are doing all sorts of activities, but what happens in this episode, what makes it absolutely hilarious, is the escalation of like pranks that Kenny does to Spenny. And this can result in some of the funniest and some of the like most dangerous sort of pranks in the show's entire history, if you think about it. For example, he locks Spenny into a sauna at one point, and Spenny gets knocked out, or suffers a heat stroke essentially. He also sets fire to Spenny at one point, which is actually towards the end, and that's how he ends up getting Spenny to take off his gorilla suit. But yeah, this episode is all sorts of just insanity. Kenny even gets a guy and his mother to dress up as gorillas, and Spenny attacks them thinking that it's Kenny, and what results is Spenny like freaking out. Oh shit, I'm sorry, because of course Spenny has a lot of anger problems. This episode is just hilarious from beginning to end. Like, you wouldn't think that an idea as stupid as just wearing a gorilla costume for several days would be so good, but it genuinely is. It's just hilarious, absolutely hilarious. I totally recommend it. And the humiliation in this episode, the humiliation is probably one of my favorites. Spenny is tied to the front of a car in the gorilla costume, while Kenny drives around boasting about his great catch, and it's just hilarious. Like, this episode is just funny from beginning to end, and it's such an absurd, stupid idea, but it manages to work overall. Speaking of dress up, Who Makes the Most Convincing Woman is an episode that is just so boring. Like, I don't know what else to say. It's just incredibly boring. You'd think an idea where Kenny and Spenny dress up as women for like a day would be quite funny. And honestly, if this was done like a few seasons later, it would have been really funny. Like, imagine if they went out in the public and did all sorts of activities and then were judged at the end of it by all sorts of people about like who was the more convincing woman. It would have been a hell of a lot funnier than this, which is basically Kenny and Spenny have to dress up in drag and they're going to be judged by actual women. And how do I put this? Spenny looks nothing like a woman, and yet ends up winning because he acts more like a woman than Kenny, who actually looks like a woman, but acts nothing like a woman, if that makes sense. And whilst that does sound funny on speaking about it, as an episode, when you're watching it, you are bored out of your mind. Like, this episode is just so tiresome. There's nothing really funny about this episode. There's no real gags. Kenny tries to break Spenny throughout this episode, and unfortunately this is season 1, so season 1 is a lot more slow and a lot more, timid, I guess you could say. And Spenny, by this point in season 1, he isn't as paranoid or as skittish as he would become later on down the line. So, of course, he won't break character. And this episode just has nothing going for it. There's nothing interesting about it. Spenny looks nothing like a woman and somehow wins the most convincing woman competition. While Kenny, looks like a woman but doesn't really act like a woman, just acts like Kenny like he usually does. I feel like this episode chose the wrong winner. I won't lie. I do think that Kenny should have won this. Because whilst he didn't really act like a woman, he still acted very bitchy and very, snarky, which, let's be honest, a lot of women do act like that. But yeah, I just feel like this episode just is too boring, and it could have worked. That's the thing. This episode could have worked, but it's just too boring and too dull and too forgettable to work now. This may be controversial for some, but for my number 7th best choice, it's who can blow the biggest fart, I should say. Now, a lot of people consider this to be the best episode of the show's history, and I do think that it is certainly in my top 10, but I don't think it is the greatest. And the reason why is because at the end of the day, all it is just two men fighting for the whole episode, and it does get a little bit boring at times, but nonetheless, it is still a fantastic episode. So what's the competition? Well, Kenny and Spenny have to blow a fart. I have to blow the loudest. And their humiliation is they meet a guy who was basically born without an anus or born without a butthole, and he basically farts in their face. That's essentially the humiliation. But essentially, yeah, it's a very simple concept. Who can blow the biggest fart? Who can get it recorded? And who wins? And what's interesting about this episode is that there's not actually a lot of cheating. In fact, it's a very legitimate competition, this one, because Kenny plays it out by the rules for the most part. I mean, he does still go ahead and cheat near towards the end, but it doesn't really matter. He still won the competition legitimately. While Spenny, also does the competition legitimately. And what's funny about this episode is that Spenny could have won this episode had he recorded one of his farts. Had he recorded one of his farts, which was incredibly loud, he would have won the episode. But because he forgot to record it, or because he had it the wrong way around, Kenny ends up winning because he blows a really big fart. Essentially, this episode is just farts. I don't know what else to say. It's genuinely an entertaining episode, and it's certainly one of the best. But like I said, I don't think it's the greatest. I do think there are episodes that are far more funny, are far more, ludicrous, it's far more entertaining, and far more legitimate. And you'll see this later on in my best list, but this is still a good episode. I just don't think it's the greatest. I think it is a little bit overrated, but overall, it's understandable why so many people love this episode. It is funny. It is great. It is somewhat of a legitimate competition, and it's surprisingly wholesome. It's surprisingly a wholesome episode. They don't really go after each other and try and kill each other like they usually do, which is a nice change of pace. Speaking of bad Series 1 episodes, Who Can Win a Court Case is perhaps the most boring Series 1 episode of them all. Nothing happens. There are no real gags in this episode. And what's ironic is it's a pretty legitimate episode. There's no real, cheating going on at all. Both of them play out legitimately. Essentially, they both go to court, and one has to win the case. Kenny ends up winning. The end. There are very few gags in this episode, and it feels like a time waster. It feels like a filler episode. It feels like they just felt like, let's do this idea of an episode, and the idea isn't very interesting. The concept isn't very interesting. The execution certainly isn't interesting. This is, for me, the most boring of the Series 1 episodes. I didn't really like it. I mean, maybe someone out there likes this episode. I certainly didn't. Honestly, I'm not a fan of this episode. Just incredibly boring. There's nothing really to say. It's just dull. Extremely, extremely dull and forgettable. Not much to say. I'm sorry. There's not much to say. Speaking of forgettable or unforgettable in this case, the best for number 6 is who can keep a dump in their pants the longest, which is perhaps the most disgusting, most revolting, most horrific episode of them all, and yet it is also one of the funniest of them all. Even the deleted scenes for this episode are hilarious. So basically, and this is really revolting, but it's funny, Kenny and Spenny have to shit themselves, and they have to keep that shit in these giant adult diapers or adult nappies, and they have to keep it in there for the longest. And it's such a revolting concept, and it is such a revolting episode. Like, Kenny tries to put powder and all sorts of stuff, bird feed I believe he does at one point, and down his nappy to try and prevent the shit from smelling and to try and prevent it. And throughout the episode, you can see the camera people, the camera crew, just gagging in there or close to vomiting. And even I find this to be perhaps the sickest episode of them all. But why is it one of the best if I keep saying it's the sickest? Well, it's hilarious. Let's be honest. It's absolutely hilarious. And the episode increases in tension or escalation, I should say, when at one point Kenny goes to I forgot the guy's name, the Asian doctor, and gets some treatment to prevent him from shitting, to prevent him from smelling, to prevent him from basically, hurting him, to making the shitty diaper worse. Whereas Spenny decides to go ahead and do the exact same thing. However, Kenny told the doctor to give Spenny laxatives. And I think you can kind of guess where that leads. Spenny is just tortured for the second half of this episode, and it is some of the funniest you can imagine. He just suffers so greatly, and it is just horrific. It's horrific to see and horrific to hear, but you can't help but laugh at how horrific it is. It's certainly the more jackassy sort of stunt show-esque style episode, this, and that probably is why I've rated it so highly, why I think it's so much better than the fart episode, because I am a huge fan of stunt shows. I am a huge fan of Jackass and all that. But yeah, this is a genuinely horrific episode, but it's horrific in the sense that it is funny. It is funny. And eventually Spenny ties this plastic bag around him and uses tape to wrap it up, and they decide, or Kenny decides, they're going to have a competition to basically burst each other's nappy, diaper, whatever you want to call it. And what results is them getting kicked in the ass, being dragged across gravel, and of course Spenny gets kicked in the nuts, and going on a seesaw and slide and all that. But then this horrific ending, which, by this point, Spenny didn't really need to be humiliated at the end of this episode, because what happened to Spenny is just horrific. Spenny's makeshift diaper nappy snaps, and I should probably warn you, even though this is censored and it's got blur and all that, you can still see through the plastic blue bag this just shit all over it. But yeah, the two go for it, and Spenny's breaks, but not to make matters worse, Spenny has more bowel problems, and he runs to this toilet, which is at a children's park of all places. And he's just left in this state. You just see him on the floor with just shit everywhere. And it is just horrific. Like, you can sort of imagine, like, the smell. You can sort of imagine what the camera crew were like when they saw that. And it was... Like, I'm a pretty big germaphobe. I don't like germs. I don't like anything like that. I don't like mucus or shit or vomit or anything like that. But I find this to be absolutely hilarious. It's a horrific episode, but it's hilarious. You've got a really bad episode when both the main leads in your show don't want to do the challenge they are set up. This is the Who is the Better Journalist challenge or competition, and my God, is this a boring episode. This feels like a Series 1 episode that was somehow pushed into another series. And it's just not very good. When I was doing research for what other people thought of Kenny versus Spenny episodes, I noticed that this episode tends to pop up in the worst lists for a lot of reasons. But the most obvious reason is, as I've just stated in the beginning of this, is that neither Kenny or Spenny wanted to do this challenge. No, neither of them wanted to do this competition. And it's so obvious that neither of them give a flying fuck about it. It is just so tedious. It is so boring. There's not really many gags in this episode. Nothing really makes you laugh, even when there are. And the ending is, once again, one of these somewhat staged endings, in the sense that Kenny doesn't even bother showing up because they're both being judged for their journalistic skills. And Spenny turns up. He doesn't really give out a good presentation, but Kenny doesn't even bother turning up. And the reason why is because he's basically having sex with someone that he was going to do an article on. And I don't believe for a second that actually happened. I don't deny that he probably did have sex with her. I don't deny that he probably didn't bother. Well, he obviously didn't turn up, but I don't think those are connected. I bet you he probably just thought that this is a stupid competition and just gave up. Because if you've seen Kenny in any other episode, you know for a fact he wouldn't just, give up because of some chick, But my God, this episode, it has nothing going for it. It feels like a Series 1 episode, but it's not even a part of Series 1. This is Series 2. You'd think by this point, the show has upgraded itself. It has expanded itself. It's become a bit more raunchy, a bit more, in your face, a bit more offensive, I dare say. And instead we get this really bored and tired episode, this episode that has nothing going for it. It sucks. It really sucks. And it's no wonder so many people hate this episode. Who Can Be a Better Journalist is one that you should definitely skip. Just don't see it. It's a Series 1 episode that somehow ended up in Series 2. Speaking of Series 1, here is a Series 1 episode that is considered by many, and myself included, to be the best Series 1 episode of them all, and that is Who Can Stay Up the Longest. Such a simple premise. Basically, Kenny and Spenny have to see who can stay up the longest without falling asleep whatsoever. And this challenge must have been absolute hell. I know for a fact, as someone who suffers from insomnia, that getting tired is not a nice feeling. And feeling tired constantly is not a nice feeling. And, the desire to go to sleep is so great. And in a challenge like this, where you're forced to stay up and you're not allowed to sleep, it must have been absolutely awful. This is one of the few times that you see Kenny actually break in an episode. Like, he gets really upset at one point and he starts moaning about how much he really wants to go to sleep, but he just can't. And Spenny, Spenny is almost dazed and confused throughout this episode. And his tactics are beyond unusual or strange or stupid or however you want to put it. For example, he thinks that having a bunch of loud children playing about his nieces and nephews is a is a good idea, and well, it wasn't, because it just made him even more tired. Kenny, on the other hand, drinks a load of coffee to try and keep himself awake, but it's obviously still not working, and he has this really annoying buzzer at one point where if he puts his neck down, it will make this loud buzzing sound. It's really horrific. sound, and it must have been really annoying to wear, especially up close. It's annoying on telly, but nonetheless, like, this is a really tough challenge for them, and it's a very simple challenge, all things considered. But it's a really good episode because it's one of the very, very few times that both Kenny and Spenny aren't cheating. They're actually playing the competition legitimately, and the competition is really, really interesting. It's an interesting watch, and there's one of my favorite parts has to be the museum moment where Kenny quite cleverly gets himself like a motor scooter, while Spenny is forced to walk around and wait for Kenny every so often as they go through this museum to keep themselves awake. The competition is such a drag for both of them, and it's absolutely painful for them to stay awake for so long, that it's quite enjoyable to watch in a way. In the end, of course, Spenny ends up falling asleep, Kenny wins, and the punishment, if I can recall correctly, was basically Spenny has to be Kenny's slave for a day or for a few moments. That includes going to the toilet and washing up after him. It's a pretty brutal punishment. But overall, this is a fantastic episode. This is certainly the best Series 1 episode, and it's no wonder that it's got its own commentary track because, well, this one is really, really good. Everything about this episode is great. It's a little bit light on laughs, I won't lie, but it's a very good episode. It's a very effective episode, very interesting challenge, and very interesting to see both of them actually play legitimately as opposed to trying to cheat against each other. It's a really good episode. Totally recommend this. In fact, if you don't really want to watch Series 1 because it's a little bit bad, in fact, it's pretty boring, Series 1, just watch this episode and then skip the rest. That's what I'd recommend. Now, for my next pick for the worst list, it is perhaps the creepiest and most disturbing episode of them all. And that is who can basically sleep with each other's mum. That is the premise. Kenny and Spenny have to go and visit each other's mother, and whoever manages to sleep with her or conduct any sexual act with her wins the competition. And right away, that's a pretty disturbing and pretty dark competition idea. And it isn't helped that this episode is very light on laughs. Like, the funniest it gets is when Kenny, who clearly doesn't want to do this competition at all, is with this pig, and he pretends that pig is Spenny's mum. And there's some gags there. But the problem with this episode is that it concentrates a lot on Spenny, who is almost too eager to do this competition. And Spenny comes across as the most creepiest motherfucker of them all. Like, the way he acts towards Kenny's mum, the way he tries to entice her, the way he tries to seduce her, it is fucking creepy. And it's unsettlingly creepy. It's not like, haha, kind of funny, creepy. No, this is unsettlingly creepy. And that's the problem with this episode. It's unsettling. Now, I'm not saying that Kenny versus Spenny's dark humor doesn't work. It works quite well. You know, Kenny in particular has a lot of dark humor he has, but he's very funny. Spenny, on the other hand, he's not very funny. And this episode shows him at perhaps his worst. He's just so creepy and unsettling to be around. And Kenny's mum eventually just snaps at him, and rightly so. And he just spoils the competition as to what it is. And my God, is it just fucked up seeing Spenny actively begging Kenny's mum to fuck him or to give him a hand job or a blow job or anything like that. It's just an unsettling episode. But it's then topped off by what Kenny does. And Kenny essentially sexually assaults a woman. Kenny essentially rapes someone in this episode. And yeah, I don't know how you can make jokes about that, if I'm perfectly honest. He basically gets drunk. And he gets her drunk and supposedly, and apparently was filmed, he did something sexual towards her. And yeah, this is just an unsettling episode. It's not really very funny, except for maybe the pig gag, but that's about it. This is an episode that you can tell Kenny in particular isn't really interested in this competition, but Spenny is way too eager, and I just don't like this episode. It's a very creepy episode. It's a very unsettling episode. It's a very morbid episode overall. I don't think many people actually like this episode. Like, when I looked up online to see what other people thought, this episode seems to get a bit of a negative reaction. But yeah, it's just a really unsettling episode. Spenny is at his worst. He's perhaps the most creepy motherfucker of them all. And it doesn't help that he's a very socially awkward weirdo. And Kenny clearly doesn't want to do this competition. It's very obvious throughout the whole episode. And when he's kind of forced to do it, he isn't happy about it. It's a very fucked up episode, and it's not fucked up in the haha, it's quite funny, or oh my god, outrageous sense. It's fucked up in the sense that it's disturbing. It's unsettling. In a more positive aspect, for my number 4 best, it is who can imitate the other better. This is just hilarious. I don't know what else to say. Basically, as the title suggests, they have to imitate each other. Kenny has to pretend to be Spenny, and Spenny has to pretend to be Kenny. However, immediately they both do caricatures of one another. Spenny's Kenny is a lot more like unhygienic. He just says a bunch of offensive things. He just says a bunch of Spenny mum jokes all the time. While Kenny's Spenny has this like plastic nose stuck onto him, big eyebrows, and he's a wimp. He gets aggressive, and he's obviously exaggerated to being homosexual and all that. And what's brilliant about this episode is that it reminds me a lot of the Who is Cooler episode, except this one is just 10 times funnier. Like, the Who is Cooler episode is still a decent watch. It just kind of lacks in the sense that it doesn't really get anywhere other than, Spenny, trying to look after Kenny, who pretends to be on a drug overdose. But this one, this one is similar in the sense that, like the Who is Cooler episode, and quite a lot of episodes for that matter, Spenny overreacts. Spenny breaks character, and it's just perfect for Kenny, because Kenny basically automatically wins whenever Spenny does that. And the things that Kenny does while pretending to be Spenny, it just gets worse and worse in the funny sense, I should say. It just gets worse and worse in the funny sense. And what I mean by, like, he does things like, he goes into Kenny, or Spenny's room, and asks Kenny, where's my dildo? The dildo that I have. And it's obviously implying that he's gay. There's also him playing on the guitar, pretending, singing about his grandfather molesting him. Jesus Christ, I'm laughing just thinking about it. There's the bed scene where, Spenny dressed as Kenny goes in and sees his own bedroom, sees like blood on a dildo. He sees like gay porno mags. He sees all this horrible stuff, and it's just hilarious. And it gets even worse. Like, he goes to the toilet at one point and eats like a brownie mixture, but it looks like shit. And once again, Spenny sees Kenny doing this and freaks out. Like, throughout the episode, like, Spenny actually starts off quite well. I won't lie, Spenny starts off quite well imitating Kenny, but because he breaks character, he screws himself over. And what's hilarious is that he thinks that he deserves to win at the end, and he doesn't. He doesn't deserve to win because he kept breaking character. And, this is one of the issues that Spenny has, like, throughout the whole series. Like, even the pro wrestler, the Who is Cooler, Spenny will break character even though he should just stay in character. And he never learns his lesson. But this one takes the biscuit for being the funniest. This one is just absolutely hilarious. I won't lie, though, the punishment at the end, the humiliation, was a bit lame. This one wasn't as good. But overall, this is a great episode. Totally recommend it. Absolutely hilarious from beginning to end. After the disturbing episode of my previous worst one, this worst one is bad in the sense that it has literally no humor and you just feel bad watching it. This is often regarded by many as the worst Kenny versus Spenny episode, although there is one episode that a lot of people consider even worse than that. But I have seen it top a lot of lists. It's often number 2 or number 1, and that is Who Do Gay Guys Like More? Now, a lot of people don't like the Who Do X Like More challenges or competitions, because let's be honest now, they're not very good. Who do kids like more is a bit boring. Who do elderly like more is a bit boring. Who do disabled people like more is probably that best one of the lot, but only because of what Kenny does. And it's just so cruel. And what's even funny is that one of the disabled people actually know who Kenny and Spenny is and still vote for Kenny. But this one is perhaps the worst of the lot, and for very good reason. Basically, Kenny and Spenny, it's similar to the Series 1 episode where Who Does She Like More episode, where basically Kenny and Spenny go on a date with a gay guy. Spenny goes first, and Spenny is actually pretty successful. He's pretty decent about it. Kenny does it second, and Kenny does something which is immensely cruel. And this episode it doesn't really have any laughs, this episode. This episode really has no laughs, no real jokes in it. It's just a cruel, cruel episode. It's mean-spirited. And basically what Kenny does is, and this is probably Kenny at his worst, Kenny pretends that he and Spenny are actually in a gay relationship, and he tries to trick the gay guy into thinking, all these things, and reveals all these horrible things about Spenny in an effort to try and get Spenny in particular to lose. However, he ends up upsetting the gay guy, and the gay guy gets really distressed to the point that he just tells the cameras to go away. And he basically screws up the competition as a whole, Kenny, with his prank, I guess you could call it. And they both get humiliated at the end. And honestly, this episode is like the previous one, but not in a disturbing sense, more in the more distressing sense. It's just a mean-spirited and disturbing episode. It's just not really nice. I know Kenny vs. Spenny isn't a nice show in general, but that's a really silly thing to say, but this episode just didn't feel as lighthearted or as funny. It felt cruel. And that's what makes this episode so mean-spirited and so hated, is that it's just so unnecessarily mean. I felt really bad for the guy at the end, the gay guy. Really felt bad for him. And this is probably Kenny at his worst. This is Kenny at his not even at his least mature, but perhaps at his meanest. It was just unnecessarily cruel, this episode. It's an unnecessarily cruel episode. It's not very funny, and it's not enjoyable, at least with the previous bad one that I talked about, Get With Them Own Mother. At least it had some gags that worked. This has none. This is just mean. It is horrible. It is something that you should just avoid at all cost. In fact, avoid all the Who Do X Like More challenges. In my top 3 now, my number 3 favourite episode, one of the best episodes, has to be who can get the more stains, or who gets the stain first loses. This is a very simple premise. Both Kenny and Spenny wear these white onesies, and basically they don't get a stain. If they get a stain, they lose. However, the competition rules are so poorly constructed that Kenny exploits it multiple times. He at first spits on Spenny, which gets a stain on it, and Spenny, makes a new rule saying no, you're not allowed to get each other dirty. At another point, they have to run outside the house because Spenny stupidly, uses CO2 canister, gets it all over the house, and chokes everyone out. And when they go outside, he gets dirt on his foot and he loses again. But no, that doesn't count because of what happened. There's also the dog and several other instances that happen that just get Spenny dirty. The episode really does highlight the issue with the rule system in the show, in the sense that the rules are easily exploited, and Kenny does it so well. And the episode does a great job at it just does a great job with the humor in this. There's a running gag, as I've probably pointed out already, but there's a running gag where it tries to go to the humiliation for Spenny, but Spenny is adamant that no, it's cheating, it doesn't count, the end. And he's so adamant to win this, despite the fact that he's basically climbing uphill with no rope. It's literally against Spenny this episode. And it's just funny because it increases with the stupidity or the challenges, and eventually they both decide, you know what, who can get the most stains is the loser. And as per usual, Kenny ends up dominating Spenny. He basically wins every single one of the competitions, or mini competitions, and Spenny, he throws a hissy fit because he's lost. And the ending and this punishment is absolutely brutal, but it's also one of the funniest and perhaps one of my favourite punishments. And that is basically, at one point in the episode, Spenny has this, I forgot what it's called, it's a zoo ball or something like that, something like that. I don't remember. One of those big inflatable balls that you go inside. And he uses it to try and protect himself. But of course, Kenny, early in the episode, pisses in it. For the humiliation for this episode, Spenny is forced to go inside that with dog shit thrown inside. And he is pushed downhill. And he's just stained with dog shit. And it is horrible. It is disgusting. But it's hilarious. It's one of my favourite humiliations. This episode has a lot of highlights. It has a lot of great stuff. It's a great challenge idea as well. I really like this idea of who can be the tidiest. And I love the idea that it does also highlight the issue surrounding the rule system that Kenny versus Spenny has. And that is, it's very easily exploited. And especially when neither of them actually do a good job at talking about the rules. But also, another thing which I like is that it's a challenge that centers around cleanliness. And throughout the series, there's often comments made about Kenny being unhygienic and, dirty and smelly and all that. Well, Spenny is OCD. He has to be clean. He has to be precise. He has to be, everything like that, And it's an idea that sort of exploits that also. And at the same time, Spenny ends up being screwed over more times than Kenny does. Kenny actually ends up being more clean than Spenny does. It's such a stupid but fun idea, and the humiliation is one of my favorites in the series. I absolutely love it. It's my number 3 spot for the best of Kenny versus Spenny. So my second worst Kenny versus Spenny episode is something that a lot of people, and I repeat, a lot of people, almost everyone, when I went to the subreddit, for example, to look up what everyone thought was the worst episode, almost everyone agreed that this one is the worst. A lot of people consider it to be the worst Kenny versus Spenny episode, and that is Who Can? Who Can is a Series 6 episode. And for me, it highlights when a series is dying, when a series is losing steam. They start running out of ideas. They start running out of what to do. And this episode feels like that. So essentially what this episode was meant to be, it was meant to be a sport-based competition. Now, what we know from behind the scenes from podcasts that were released later here, Spenny loved doing sport-related competitions, but Kenny hated them and always tried to avoid them and didn't want to do them. And in this case, he tries to avoid a badminton competition. For very good reason. It sounds like a really boring idea. But unfortunately, this episode isn't an episode where a competition takes place. Instead, it's an episode where basically Kenny does a bunch of silly gags where he dresses up as a Roman emperor and that's it. And the gags aren't very funny either. This is a very boring episode. There's nothing going on in it. It's a very pointless episode, like to the point that I'd argue they might as well have just not bothered filming. They might as well have just said, okay, you know what, let's not do a filming for this episode. Let's move on to the next challenge. Let's do that one instead. No, they had to film it. They had to air it. And it feels like a filler episode. It feels like a filler episode for a show that, let's be honest, that doesn't really have filler episodes because it's a reality show. Let's be honest. Who Can is hated among the community. And it's like, I've seen this top so many different lists when I looked online. Like, this is just despised, and I can see why. It's not a competition. It is just a bunch of stupid gags throughout the whole episode, and it's not funny gags either. It's a very boring episode. It's an episode that feels like it belongs in a show that is dying, and let's be honest, our Series 6 was the final series, so, maybe this might have killed the ratings. It wouldn't surprise me, because Series 6 had a lot of bad episodes, but this one probably takes the biscuit as being the worst. It is just a dull episode. There's no competition. Nothing goes on. It's just a bunch of gags. It sucks. It is awful. But at least it had something going for it, unlike my number one that you'll find out later after I do my second best. For the second best is the first episode of the second season. This is how you show that you've moved on from what is a pretty tame and lame first series, and this is how you show that you're going to go more extreme, more powerful, more, over the top with who can drink more. Who can drink more involves Kenny and Spenny drinking nothing but alcohol for God knows how long, and whoever pukes loses. Now, this episode is fantastic. This is just absolutely fantastic. From beginning till end, it is nothing but humorous gags here and there. It is a great idea for a competition, and what takes place is just hilarious. So, right from the get-go, Kenny cheats. He cheats by buying non-alcoholic beer. But because Kenny and Spenny have got their own sets of beer, and all of them basically look the same, except they've got a big label on them, which is either red or white, to indicate whose it belongs to. Kenny, obviously, he can get away with this non-alcoholic beer because there's a big, I think he has the red label stuck on it. So that's already something straight away. Spenny, on the other hand, is drinking nothing but alcohol. And this is the first time we ever find out about Spenny's alcoholism, which even affects him to this day, as Kenny has revealed. Spenny being drunk is one of the funniest things you can imagine. And the things that Kenny does to get back at Spenny is just brutal. The first thing he does is he gets these alcoholic rehab people coming in, these Alcoholics Anonymous individuals, these counselors, I guess you call them. They come in and they basically tell Spenny, you got an addiction, you need help. And of course, Spenny is clearly drunk at this moment. He just chugs another bowl down. But then, later on, Spenny gets so drunk that he almost vomits quite a few times, but he never actually does, which is surprising to Kenny and even Spenny for that matter. And he falls asleep quite a few times, and Kenny at one point, he does this I don't know, it's like smelling salts or something, and he sticks it in Spenny's mouth, and Spenny just erupts in anger. I think this is the first time we ever see a truly angry Spenny, and Spenny just, it's quite frightening what happens. You gotta feel, I always felt bad for Kenny, but of course Kenny is the one that kind of deserved it. He almost gets hit with a hockey stick. Beer bottles are smashed and go flying. He breaks one of the photos, and he storms out of the house, and he tries to climb up a tree. He ends up cutting his face as he falls off the tree. Spenny then yells at the camera about how much he always loses and how much Kenny wins, and then he bursts into tears, crying on Kenny's shoulder. And this whole segment, and I'm laughing just thinking about it, this whole segment, it's just hilarious. This is one of the funniest episodes. This is one of the better competitions. This is just a truly great episode. And everything about it is just funny. It's just funny. And the funny thing is, Spenny still doesn't vomit. Spenny is so out of his mind. And, the marching band. I forgot about the marching band. Imagine an incredibly intoxicated Spenny. And I don't know whether you've been intoxicated, but I know I certainly have. And I know for a fact that loudness can truly fuck you up. And in this case, Spenny is woken up rudely by a marching band playing loudly in his room. And you can just imagine how bad his head must have been feeling from that. And he doesn't even react. He sort of just covers himself with a pillow. So that happens. Kenny is actually getting really annoyed, by the way. He's still drinking the non-alcoholic beer, which just annoys him a lot. While Spenny, he's just out of it. And the competition slowly comes to an end when Spenny is drunkenly dancing and going "yeah" to the camera. He eventually just falls down unconscious, and Kenny decides, and Kenny arguably loses this competition, but obviously they don't find out until afterwards. Kenny, he drinks like a bunch of muesli, he eats a bunch of muesli, and he like drinks a bunch of stuff, and then he vomits it out in front of Spenny's unconscious body. So it makes it seem like Spenny has lost. And of course, the humiliation is such a gross humiliation. It is vile. I hate it, but at the same time, it's such a brutal but funny humiliation. Spenny has to eat the vomit. That's the humiliation. It's a fucked up humiliation. It's something that would happen in Dirty Sanchez. It's something that would happen in Dirty Sanchez. But my God, is it a brutal and funny humiliation. This episode is just funny overall. Like, this is an episode which it just shows to you, like, this is us improving from our previous series. This is us showing you this is what we're capable of. And it is brilliant at doing that. It is a message to anyone who's watching the show or would have been watching the show at the time. We're going to be more extreme this time around. We're not going to be pussyfooting around like we did in the previous series. We're going to be more extreme, more in your face. And that is so highlighted in this episode. This is a truly fantastic episode. Who Can Drink More Beer is fantastic and is a definite watch for all. It is funny. It can be frightening. It can be downright insane. It is fantastic. Finally, on the number one worst Kenny versus Spenny episode, and this one isn't even an episode, let's be honest now. This is like, Who Can is often stated as the worst Kenny versus Spenny episode of them all, but this episode is so forgotten and so like no one ever remembers it, but it's just awful. And that is who can lift more weights with their genitals. Now, the idea itself sounds like a really obscure, wild, silly idea where Kenny and Spenny have to hold a bunch of weights using their genitalia. However, this challenge, I should say, barely lasts like 5 minutes before it ends. Because Spenny freaks out, he gives up, and he storms out the house. And what we get is an episode where the entire thing is nothing more than a staged episode. Now, as I said earlier, Kenny and Spenny have both said multiple times that this show is not staged, everything is real. But how the fuck can you justify this episode? Like, how the fuck can you say that this episode is not staged? Like, maybe the fact that Spenny stormed out and left the competition early, maybe that bit is the real bit. But everything else in this episode is nothing but staged bullshit, and it is unfunny as hell. Essentially, Kenny decides to find a replacement Spenny, and he gets all these other people involved, and they're not as good as Spenny, and he realizes that he needs Spenny, and it feels like something you'd see from, like, The Simpsons, for God's sake. Like, in fact, there was a Simpsons episode like this, where a grandpa and Homer went and made this potion or lotion or drink that made people hypersexualized, and eventually they broke up, and he had tried finding a replacement son, It's something like that. It's such a formulaic and staged episode that this episode has no reason to exist. Like, a lot of people say that Who Can has no reason to exist. Like, Who Can is such an awful episode, but no one ever talks about how bad this episode, no one ever remembers this episode. Like, even I, forgot when this episode took place. Like, I had to look on the Kenny Hotz's YouTube channel, and I thought, was this episode real? Was it not? And then I saw it pop up, and I realized, holy shit, it is a real episode. I didn't imagine it. It really is an episode that did exist. And it's so fucking awful. It is just boring. It is boring. It has no reason to exist. It had no reason to be filmed. Like, maybe as soon as Spenny went on a tangent on how much he hates the show and how much he didn't want to be in it, and stormed off. Maybe they should just cut the filming and decide to resolve things behind the scenes. No, they had to film a fucking episode. They had to film an episode and waste over 25 minutes of our lives for this piece of shit episode. There is nothing good about this episode. There is no reason that this episode has to exist. It is awful. Who can lift the more weights with their genitalia has no reason to exist. It is forgettable. It is boring. It is lifeless. It is a staged episode, and there's no way Kenny and Spenny can go ahead and say that nothing in the show is staged, everything is real, when shit like this exists. Fuck this episode. And I don't think I've seen a single person praise this episode, like, at all. And in fact, I don't think I've ever seen anyone talk about this episode. It's that bad. It is that bad. It is awful. It is worse than Who Can. Like, I don't care what anyone says. Who Can is bad, but this is worse than Who Can. Worse. I hate this episode. There is nothing more to add. It is awful. Just skip it. In fact, you might even just skip it anyway, because barely anyone remembers it. Barely anyone watches it. Fuck this episode. For my number one pick, it's probably no surprise to many people, because this is perhaps the most infamous, most famous Kenny versus Spenny episode. It's the one where Spenny is drugged, and it's such a stupid idea, but it's such a hilarious idea. All at the same time, this is who can wear a dead octopus the longest on their head. And, well, what do I say? I mean, a lot of people, including myself, when I first heard of Kenny versus Spenny, I heard of this episode in particular. I heard nothing but this episode, because my friends, they were the first ones to watch it. And I never knew what this show was all about, but the one episode that I was always told was who can wear a dead octopus on their head the longest. And it's also the one episode I see so many people reference, there's so many people talk about. And for good reason. This episode is a fucking classic. It is the best Kenny versus Spenny episode by a long shot. Everything about this is so memorable, so funny, so ludicrously insane. And it is, once again, like the drinking episode, it escalates in the insanity, and it gets worse, and it gets worse and worse, and it's getting even better. So basically, they go to a market, they buy a dead octopus. Well, they both buy a dead octopus each, and they have to wear it on their head. Very simple premise, very simple idea, wearing a dead octopus on their head. However, almost immediately, Kenny cheats. Kenny cuts off the tentacles because he just cannot bear wearing this dead octopus on his head, because it's cold, it smells, and apparently, even when they were filming series 4 and 5, the smell was still in the household. Like, that's how intense the smell was. It's cold, it's wet, it's slimy, it smells. Kenny cuts off the tentacles and sews it onto his Rasta hat, which he initially wore in the episode to cover up the octopus. And of course, Spenny, he wears this rag around his head to cover up the octopus. But Kenny takes it a bit further. And like I said right at the beginning, Spenny gets drugged. Kenny goes and finds a bunch of people selling LSD. And he does this out of revenge for something that Spenny did when they were kids. Essentially, Spenny, when they went to see the movie Tron, spiked his popcorn with LSD, and he was off his head for God knows how long. So he decides to buy some LSD, and he spikes Spenny's drink. Spenny drinks it, and at first everything's a bit blurry and he's a bit tipsy, but he doesn't know what's going on. But the drugs kick in, and they kick in hard. And my God, do we see just the display of a human being devolving? It's a devolution of a human being. Spenny is fucked. Let's be honest, Spenny is fucked throughout this episode. And it just gets worse and worse. And I'm laughing while I say it gets worse. It's worse in the funny sense. Spenny, he starts talking about the miracles of life and all that at one point. He sees like a little bug and he's like fascinated with a little bug. When the bug gets crushed by either Kenny or one of the camera crew, Spenny freaks out. Spenny, he's easily amused and acts like a child throughout this episode. Like, this is probably the happiest you see Spenny, by the way. Like, Spenny is unhappy throughout the whole series, but this is like the one time that you see Spenny really happy, aside from maybe the weed episode. But yeah, Spenny, he's giggling his head off. He's just out of it. Kenny dresses up as a bunny, and he sees this white rabbit. He follows the white rabbit, which, is a bit of an allegory for drugs anyway. Kind of funny visual humor there. But what's even like more bizarre, what's even more funny is that Spenny keeps the dead octopus on his head. He doesn't take it off. Even when he's off his head, he doesn't take it off at any point. He still has it wrapped around his head. So poor Kenny still has to be in the competition. And Kenny fucks with Spenny. Like, at one point he tries to scare Spenny. He dresses up as a bunny, takes him to his bedroom, and then he comes out with this skull mask and he screams at him, and Spenny falls back and he breaks a part of he breaks a cabinet in the bathroom. And he says this line which is absolutely hilarious, and it's something along the lines of, "I was born, man." I mean, Spenny High is hilarious. Oh, but it gets even worse. Don't you worry, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. It gets even worse. Spenny goes outside at one point, and he's in nothing but his underwear, and he's still got the octopus on his head. And he shits himself outside, and the look on his face as he stares, it's just hilarious. You just see this pathetic human being, this pathetic looking face, as he shits himself. And he's taken in by the camera crew to clean him up, and he still has that really face. Oh, but it gets even worse. Don't you worry. Spenny escapes. Spenny actually manages to escape at one point. And Kenny, once again, this is one of the few times that Kenny actually shows legit fear or emotion that isn't just taking the piss or mockery. He has to chase after Spenny, and they get him into a van. And they take him to the beach. And Spenny finally gets rid of the dead octopus, and he throws it into the sea. And my God... does it end this torment for Spenny, even though Spenny is probably high, and he's probably remained high for the rest of the day or days, because LSD doesn't go away in a few hours. It stays with you. And the humiliation for this episode, believe it or not, there are two humiliations. One is disturbing as hell. The other is a lot more tame, which isn't as funny, but it's still a good humiliation. Especially the tame one, which you see on the channel, on the YouTube channel, is he has to eat sushi off of Kenny's ass, and in between his ass crack and all that. And it's pretty tame. It's pretty lame. I mean, it is made up for the fact that Kenny farts on one of the pieces that he eats, and it's just fucked up, and he almost vomits. Poor Spenny. You feel almost bad for the guy. But the other one, my God, this other humiliation is just fucked up. This one, no wonder they didn't air it on telly, because this is borderline. Well, this is bestiality. This is basically bestiality. Spenny sticks his tongue in the asshole of a cat. It's fucked up, I know. Yeah, so bestiality occurs. And by the way, this is the same cat that appears early in the episode when Kenny tries to get the octopus off his head before he drugs Spenny by hanging this cat over his head, and the cat doesn't freak out or try to eat the octopus. It just runs away. Yeah, this episode, my God, is it fucked up, but it's hilarious. This is the funniest episode of the entire series. This is the most memorable episode of the entire series. This is my number one pick for the best Kenny versus Spenny episode of all time. I hope you enjoyed this ranking or this list of my least favorite and my favorite Kenny versus Spenny episodes. It's a fantastic show overall. I do recommend watching the show, although I won't lie, series 1 is a bit of a drag. I think the best series for me personally was series 4. That is a series which doesn't really have any bad episodes whatsoever. Everything in that series is really good. The worst series is either series 1 or series 6. They're both pretty lame, but overall it's a fantastic show. It's a great show full of great competition ideas, great just great humor in general. The arguments that Kenny and Spenny get involved are hilarious. Even the deleted scene of the suitcase rant is just funny as fuck. I totally recommend you watch this show, and I'll see you next time for whatever video I put out.